They buried him with honors, but I found what he truly left me under our floor. It wasn't money, it was a weapon wrapped in a signature. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm not the kind of woman people remember in family photographs. I was the one behind the camera, the one refilling water glasses during toasts, the one who laughed politely at stories told by louder people. But I was there. For every deal, every dinner, every quiet panic the Callahan family swept under their Turkish rugs. And when Charles married me 15 years after his first wife died, they said I was too young for him. Now, at 68, I suppose I'm too old for them. Too old to challenge the will. Too old to remember details. Too old to dig up what they buried. But I was a court stenographer for 37 years. And I never forget the exact words someone uses to lie. The air in the Callahan chapel was cold, not from the weather, but from the silence. Every pew was filled with suits and pearls, the Callahan family seated in a perfectly curated front row. Bethany, the oldest daughter, wore gray instead of black. A modern take on mourning, she whispered to a photographer before the service started. I sat 2 rows behind them. By request. Charles' casket sat at the center, oak, polished, far too expensive for a man who once called funerals grandstanding for the grieving. The minister spoke of legacy, of leadership, of land and loyalty. Not once did he say the word wife. After the service, the reception took place at the Callahan estate, our estate, though no one referred to it that way anymore. Bethany greeted guests with the smile of a woman who already owned the room. Mother Callahan's spirit still watches over this house, she told a cousin. I raised an eyebrow at that. Charles's first wife had died 30 years ago. I'd been married to him for 18. But in that moment, I understood. They were erasing me, one speech at a time. I was sipping tea in the corner of the sunroom when Miles, Bethany's younger brother, approached. He was the softest of the 3, always too gentle to survive the family's Hunger Games. He'd been quiet since Charles's stroke. Even quieter since the will reading had been postponed. He handed me a small envelope. It's from Dad, he said, not quite meeting my eye. Before he passed? Miles nodded. He told me to give it to you, but only if they didn't. They? He glanced toward Bethany, who was posing for another photo with a senator's wife. Check the study floor, he said, barely above a whisper. The loose board. He said you'd know which one. Then he walked away. I didn't wait. I left the reception unnoticed. No one watched the grieving widow who wasn't mentioned in the obituary. In the study, the fireplace was still warm from the morning's ceremonial fire. The room smelled of cedar and ash. The 3rd board from the hearth gave a soft creak when I stepped on it. I knelt, ran my fingers along the edge, and found the groove. Lifted it. Beneath the floorboard was a leather folio. Inside, a handwritten note from Charles, yellowed at the edges. Irene, if you're reading this, they've already acted. I didn't trust what they were pressuring me to sign. This is the real will. Dated. Signed. Witnessed. Keep it safe. And if they try to bury you, dig deeper. Love, C. Behind the letter was a will. The original. With my name. Executor. Heir. Owner. I sat there, fingers trembling, not with fear, but with clarity. They hadn't just excluded me. They tried to bury me under paper. But Charles knew me better than that. He knew I'd checked the floor. And now? I was done sitting behind the camera. It was time to enter the frame. The Callahan study had always been Charles's sanctuary. The floors were original pine, sanded smooth over a century of men who thought legacy lived in oak desks and antique maps. When we married, I never asked for the room, not because I didn't want it, but because Charles offered it to me without needing to be asked. And now it was mine again. Only no one else knew that yet. The will Charles had hidden was real. I recognized his handwriting, the way he curved the lowercase r, the slight drag of his pen on the second C in Callahan. I recognized the notary's stamp, Martha Kinsley, a woman I'd worked with for years back when I transcribed hearings in probate court. I even remembered the date, February 9th. It had snowed that morning. Charles's hands had been stiff with arthritis. I made him tea and watched him take a long call afterward. He didn't say what it was about, but that was the same day Bethany stormed out of the house. Now it made sense. I spread the documents across the desk and began cataloging Charles's letter, the notarized will, Exhibit A, a list of 3 bank accounts with my name added as joint beneficiary, and a small key taped to the inside flap of the folio. The key was brass. Old. It didn't match anything in the house, but I recognized it anyway. It belonged to the antique letter opener in the west hallway display case. A gift from Charles's grandfather, a custom brass antique blade with a hollow handle. I retrieved it that night, after the guests had left and Bethany had locked the liquor cabinet like I hadn't already memorized its code years ago. The display case was dusty, neglected. I pressed the small brass key into the hidden latch at the bottom of the opener's handle. It clicked. The handle separated. Inside, a tightly rolled scroll of paper stained with ink and time. It was a codicil, an amendment, one that added my name to every clause the current will excluded me from. It had been written 4 months before Charles's death, and it was never filed. I sat down in the armchair by the window and reread the codicil under the dim glow of Charles's reading lamp. It was brief, 1 page, but it carried weight. In the event that my original testament is challenged or altered by undue influence from external parties, including, but not limited to my adult children, this codicil shall supersede all amendments, and my wife, Irene Callahan, shall retain controlling ownership over all Callahan estate properties and financial trusts, filed in confidence, to be activated at the discretion of the named beneficiary. Signed, stamped, witnessed, Martha Kinsley. Again. I stared at that name. Martha was retired now, moved out of the county last year. But I had her address. We'd exchanged Christmas cards. She still owed me a favor from 2002 when she nearly lost her commission for botching a filing and I covered for her in open court. She would remember the signature. She would remember Charles. And she would remember whether this codicil was ever meant to vanish. I carefully placed the scroll in a protective sleeve, added it to my growing binder, and labeled it by hand, Exhibit B, Private Codicil, Handle Copy. Then I sealed the folio again and hid it under the cedar panel behind the study fireplace. Not because I didn't trust myself, because I knew the next step would put me back in the fire. And I wasn't walking in without proof that burned hotter than theirs. When I was a court stenographer, the attorneys used to joke that I had the ears of a hawk and the memory of a filing cabinet. But what they never joked about was this: if Irene writes it down, it happened. That's what scared them the most. Not my presence, my record. And now I had a new record, one they couldn't erase with charm or money. I had the will beneath the floorboards. I returned to the study the next morning before sunrise. The house was still. Bethany and Miles hadn't woken. The cook wouldn't arrive for another hour. I had the estate to myself, at least the parts they didn't lock me out of. Charles's original will sat beneath the hidden panel, exactly as I left it. The air beneath the floor smelled of old cedar, cold stone, and something else, finality. I unrolled it again, this time with gloved hands, and photographed each page. Then I called the only person who still owed me absolute discretion, Lorraine Brooks, my old transcription colleague, who now worked at a private estate litigation firm out in Portsmouth. She answered on the 3rd ring, groggy but lucid. "Irene," she said, "if you're calling before 7 a.m., someone must have died." "Correct," I replied. "And now someone's trying to kill his memory." She exhaled. "Give me the address." By noon, Lorraine was in my kitchen. I'd cleared the table and laid out the will, the codicil, and a copy of the family's filed will, the fake one Bethany had submitted just 3 weeks ago. She examined them carefully. "No rush. Just the quiet precision of a woman who'd spent 3 decades making other people's stories stick. When she finished reading, she looked at me with a rare, grim smile. "You've got them. Dead to rights. I want it filed. Quietly. But officially. I can certify the signatures. I'll call Martha Kinsley, too. If she verifies this codicil was filed before Charles died, we have legal cause to request a full probate freeze. And if they push back?" Lorraine folded the documents carefully. "Then we sue for conspiracy to suppress testamentary documents, and that, my dear, is a felony." The thing about families like the Callahans is that they don't believe the law applies to them. They don't shred wills. They amend intentions. They don't steal inheritances. They protect legacies. But I'd worked too long behind courtroom benches to let euphemisms dull the blade. That evening, I walked through the halls of the estate with a different kind of gaze. No longer the silent widow or the polite second wife. I was an archivist walking through a crime scene. The paintings? Claimed in the fake will by Bethany. The East Garden suite? Promised to Miles. The sunroom wing? Left to a trust controlled by Lila's silent partner. None of it was real. None of it was theirs. I passed by Charles's study again and paused. For years, I had stood behind that desk, nodding while his children played politics and Charles played peacekeeper. Now, I opened the drawer that once held his fountain pens and placed a new label on its front. Active claim. Estate litigation files. Owner. Irene Callahan. Then, I whispered to the quiet room, "I'm not your footnote anymore, Charles. I'm your correction." Every family has a myth. The Callahans had theirs carved into stone above the library fireplace, honor through continuity. To outsiders, it sounded noble, steady, a commitment to legacy. But I lived inside that myth for nearly 2 decades. And I learned that continuity was just a softer word for control, especially when it was weaponized through paperwork. I discovered the clause by accident. It wasn't hidden exactly. It was buried in language, the kind written to sound official while disguising its true weight beneath decades of dusty legal phrasing. It was tucked in the 1987 Family Trust Charter, a document I'd seen once, long ago, back when Charles had first shown me the books and explained how the fortress stays whole. The charter was framed in the upstairs hallway, next to Charles's father's portrait. No one had read it in years. But I did. And there it was, printed on page 7. In any instance where the current trustee or executor is found to have presented an altered or superseded will that does not include all previously ratified provisions, the trust shall defer to the most recent version signed and witnessed by a notary licensed in state and stored in any verifiable private estate archive. They called it the Callahan Clause, designed to prevent tampering. Ironically, now it was the very clause that would undo the tampering they orchestrated. I took a photograph of the framed charter. Then I removed it from the wall. Behind it, stuck in a sleeve taped to the backboard, was the original filing certificate, complete with the court's registration number and the Callahan Trust seal. Proof the clause had been active and binding for over 30 years. I stared at that seal for a long time, because this wasn't just leverage. It was authority. Back in the study, I placed the charter, its back-filed seal, and the notary-stamped codicil in a labeled folder. Exhibit C, Trust Clause and Successor Authority. I emailed Lorraine. Her reply came within the hour. With that clause, we can bypass Bethany's will entirely and file a motion to revert the trust to its pre-altered state, naming you as executor. Shall I begin? I typed one word in return. Yes. That night, I found Bethany standing in the parlor, drink in hand, gazing at the oil painting of her grandfather. "You should know," she said without turning, "this estate doesn't respond well to rebellion." I walked over slowly and stood beside her. Then it should have been better at preventing it. She smirked. "You found something, didn't you?" "I found the original will. I found Charles's letter. And I found the clause he buried to protect the house from exactly what you're doing." "You won't win," she said, tightening her grip on the crystal glass. "I already have," I said, eyes locked on the portrait. You just haven't received the paperwork yet." She didn't speak again. Just left the room, heels clicking like a slow retreat. She knew. Bethany knew the clause. She'd just never expected me to remember it. But that was her fatal miscalculation. I remember everything. Bethany Callahan didn't inherit her father's grace. She inherited his ruthlessness. But where Charles wielded it like a scalpel, precise, clean, almost invisible, Bethany preferred blunter tools. Pressure. Position. Appearances sharpened into weapons. And now that I was threatening her carefully choreographed future, she began to do what she always did when she felt cornered. She played nice. It started with a note slipped under my door. "Let's have tea tomorrow. No lawyers. Just us. B." Followed by a knock the next morning at precisely 10 a.m. Bethany arrived in cream-colored linen and a strand of pearls that used to belong to her mother. It was a uniform, not an outfit. The attire of someone who wanted to remind me she was still the face of the Callahan name. I served Darjeeling. She didn't touch it. "I'll be direct," she said, folding one leg over the other. "You've made things complicated. Truth has a way of doing that." Her smile didn't falter. "I know about the codicil. I know you've been in contact with Martha. And I know Lorraine Brooks is working on a petition to freeze the estate." "Good," I said, sipping my tea. "Then we can skip the part where you pretend you didn't commit fraud." Bethany's eyes narrowed, just a flicker. "I'm not here to argue," she said. "I'm here to offer a solution. Go on. You get the lake house. And a trust. Quietly. We withdraw the will from public record, refile the original, split the estate cleanly. No scandal. No press. And you retain control of the primary holdings." Her silence answered for her. I leaned forward, hands steady on the cup. "You lied in probate court, Bethany. You submitted a will you knew Charles didn't approve. You forged my exclusion. And you tried to lock me out of my own home. You were just the second wife," she snapped. "This estate belongs to our family. Then why did he put me in charge of it?" Her lips tightened. I continued, voice low, "You're not afraid of losing money. You're afraid of losing the illusion that you were always the rightful heir. That your mother's name is still the one people whisper in this house. But you and I both know Charles loved this place because it stopped being hers." The silence cracked like frost. Bethany stood, eyes glassy, breath sharp. "You can take your exhibits, your binders, your dusty memories, and try to claw your way into history. But I'm the name they'll remember." "No," I said calmly. "You'll be the cautionary tale." She left without another word. And as the front door closed, I walked to my desk and opened the folder marked /Exhibit D, Conversational Confession, Memo, because I'd recorded it all. Every word of our exchange. Admissible? Maybe. Persuasive? Absolutely. Bethany wasn't going to offer anything else after that meeting. And I didn't need her to, because now I knew her game. And I'd just rewritten the rules. The Callahan family kept meticulous records. At least, that's what they told themselves. Financial ledgers, legal filings, charitable receipts, every transaction neatly bound in leather folders and housed in the basement archive, a humidity-controlled shrine to their own self-importance. But I knew the one thing they never accounted for, the documents that should be there and aren't. I found the gap on a rainy Tuesday morning. The estate was quiet. Bethany had retreated to New York, Miles was back at the university, and Lila hadn't been seen since the funeral. It was the perfect time to explore. The basement archive was dimly lit and smelled of old varnish and pride. Rows of high shelves lined the walls, each labeled by year, by asset, by transaction type. I scanned the 2022 probate shelf. Then 2021. Then the trust audit ledgers. Everything was accounted for, except for one file, safe deposit access. March 2022, I remembered it clearly. Charles had come home that day with a white envelope, the kind the bank gives you when you retrieve items from your box. He was quiet, pensive. I'd asked if he needed help cataloging anything. He said, "Not yet." But soon, now, that file was gone. Not misfiled. Not misplaced. Removed. Because if it had been innocently forgotten, the folder tab would still exist, empty, maybe, but there. Instead, the sequence jumped from February to April. A deliberate gap. A silence someone thought no one would hear. But I heard it, because silence doesn't scare me. It signals where to dig. I returned upstairs and pulled out my private ledger, an old black notebook I'd kept since the day I married Charles. Not the kind with facts and figures, but the kind with habits. Observations. Patterns. March 14, 2022, Charles returns from bank. No gloves. Unusual for him. Says the box was too full. Mentions Lila. Strangely. First time in months. March 16, 2022, heated phone call with Miles. Ends with, "You'll get your part, but not before she does." March 18, 2022, estate accountant cancels appointment. No explanation. Charles quiet all evening. The pieces fit. Something happened that week. Something he tried to fix or hide using the bank box. And now that file was gone. Which meant whatever he pulled out was dangerous to someone. Maybe even to all three of them. I emailed Lorraine the log notes. Her response came in minutes. Check with the bank. If you're listed as joint access, even if removed later, they have to disclose the access history. She was right. So I called Fenton Heritage Bank, where the Callahan family had maintained private boxes for over 50 years. After 3 redirects, I reached a manager named Arthur who still remembered Charles. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You were on the access list until May 2022. After that, your name was removed by request of Mr. Miles Callahan." I gripped the phone tighter. "Can you send me a record of the last contents withdrawal?" A pause. Then, "I'm looking at it now. Looks like a sealed manila envelope labeled Callahan Consent and Override Form 2011. I froze. That wasn't just a family record. That was legal override language, likely from Charles's original trust draft. Language that would have prevented any will change without unanimous consent of all parties, including me. And they had removed it. Erased it. But the bank had a digital copy on file. "Would you like a copy mailed or picked up in person?" Arthur asked. "Mail it," I said. Certified. Today. And when I hung up, I opened my binder to a new tab, Exhibit E, Consent Form, Suppressed, the first deletion. But not the last. Because now I had confirmation that they hadn't just forged a will. They'd edited history. The Callahans loved legacy, but they feared transparency. That was the real family tradition. For all their talk of preserving history, of honoring lineage, they kept the wrong things in frames and the right things in hiding. Every framed certificate and portrait was a distraction, a curated story for guests. But real history? That lived in ledgers. And I found the one that mattered at the bottom of a broken file drawer, behind an outdated folder marked Maintenance, Irrigation, 2009 to 2015. What it contained had nothing to do with pipes. The book was hand-bound, navy leather, unmarked on the spine. No index, no label. But inside, neat columns of dates, amounts, and vague descriptions. April 2013, $65,000. Consultant reassignment, December 2015, $42,000. Media suppression, August 2017, $88,000. Settlement, W.P. case, June 2019, $27,500. Discretionary travel expense, L.C. The amounts weren't staggering, but the consistency was. Every few months, another quiet payout. Always categorized under the same header, scribbled in the upper right corner of each page, FFA. I flipped to the back. There, on the final page, in Charles's handwriting, FFA, Family Fund, Auxiliary. For internal matters requiring discretion. To be reviewed annually by primary signatory. It was signed. C. Callahan. The dates stretched back 15 years. Not a single payment was accounted for in the official estate ledgers. This wasn't just slush money. It was a private pipeline used to fix, cover, or eliminate internal problems. I read the entries again. The W.P. case stood out. I recognized those initials. Walter Pierce, a former groundskeeper who left abruptly in 2017 after an incident no one ever explained. I remembered the day he left. No goodbye. No reference. Just vanished. Now I knew why. They'd paid him off. And media suppression? Likely tied to Bethany's failed campaign run. There'd been a brief mention of campaign violations that mysteriously disappeared. And the travel expense labeled L. C. Lila Callahan. She'd spent that summer volunteering abroad after a DUI rumor nearly broke in the papers. Charles had shut it down before it started. Now I knew how. The fund had been Charles's secret broom, the quiet mechanism that kept the family's name spotless in public even as the rot deepened beneath. And I had the entire record. I scanned each page, created backups, stored a copy in the encrypted folder Lorraine had set up. Then I added the ledger to my growing case binder, Exhibit F, Family Fund Ledger, Auxiliary, and beneath it, I wrote, The Real Callahan Legacy. Later that night, I heard footsteps outside the study. Not heavy, not cautious, deliberate. I opened the door to find Miles standing there, face pale, holding a glass of bourbon that trembled slightly in his hand. I saw you take the blue book, he said. I said nothing. His voice cracked. Dad told me about the fund once. Said it was for emergencies. This was never about emergencies, I replied. It was about liabilities. About keeping the truth buried long enough for the next Callahan to inherit the mess. Miles nodded, defeated. Then he looked me in the eye. I'll testify if you need me to. I believed him. Not because he was brave, but because he was finally afraid of the right person. Me. They didn't knock. They waited until I left for my morning walk, the only habit I still maintained from the early days of my marriage to Charles. 40 minutes around the orchard path, past the duck pond, back through the stone gate. By the time I returned, the house smelled different. Not food. Not cleaners. Burned paper. The scent trailed me to the study, where I found the waste basket still warm, the ashes inside curling at the corners. Among the blackened shreds, I saw a flash of something familiar. My handwriting. One of my duplicate binders was gone. The one labeled Fund Backups. Private. It had been taken from my locked drawer, forced open, judging by the split in the wood, and burned in haste. Sloppy. Desperate. Effective only if I hadn't already sent copies to Lorraine and placed 2 others in a vault off-site. Still, it rattled me. Not because I lost evidence, but because they'd come into my room. Because they were done being subtle. That night, I moved the remaining originals into a fireproof case, placed it under the floorboards of the unused linen room, and sealed the entrance with a nail gun. Then I sat at the kitchen counter and waited. At 9:18 p.m., the power flickered once, and my phone lit up with a blocked call. I didn't answer. I let it ring. Let them sit with the silence of a woman who was done reacting. 2 days later, Lorraine called. They filed a motion, she said, flat and sharp. Bethany's trying to get your codicil disqualified as a forgery. She's claiming Charles was mentally unfit. Based on what? A statement from his physician, signed 3 weeks ago. That's impossible. He died 5 weeks ago. My thoughts exactly. The physician, Dr. Arthur Bell, had been retired for 2 years. The signature? Lifted from an old prescription note Charles once framed as a joke, my clean bill of health immortalized. I knew because I was the one who hung it. Now they'd scanned it, reused it, dated it. Forgery, but amateur. Sloppy, because I kept the original. And it had a different date, different handwriting pressure, even different pen ink. We submitted both. And Lorraine filed a counter-motion for fraud. Motion to strike medical testimony as falsified. Motion to request handwriting authentication under penalty of perjury. When the court responded, it did so swiftly. The judge issued a warning, Further attempts to alter or fabricate supporting testimony will result in immediate legal sanctions. A line in the ruling glowed in my mind. Evidence submitted by Mrs. Irene Callahan appears, at this stage, more consistent, credible, and historically supported than that of the respondents. That was legal speak for, we believe her more than we believe you. And I hadn't even dropped the voice recording yet. I updated my binder. Exhibit G, forgery attempt, medical fraud. Underneath, I taped a photo of the wastebasket, still glowing with embers. Let them burn what they wanted. It didn't matter, because paper burns. But the truth? That leaves a scar. The courthouse records building hadn't changed in 30 years. Same dusty blinds. Same flickering fluorescent lights. Same front desk lady with a thermos the size of a football helmet. And deep in the back, behind a rolling wall of microfiche and fading cardboard boxes, sat the one person who had never once lost a file, Marjorie Lang, county archivist, Charles' old friend, and briefly, many years ago, his lover. I hadn't spoken to Marjorie in a decade. Not because of the affair. I'd known about that. Charles told me before we were even married. One mistake, he'd said. Before I knew what I wanted, Marjorie had kept her distance out of respect. But she'd never stopped working. And now I needed her. She looked up when I entered, blinked once, and leaned back in her creaky chair. Well, well, look who's come crawling through the cobwebs. I smiled faintly. You still remember where everything is? I don't forget what matters. Good, I said, stepping closer. Because Charles left something out of the official filings. And I need you to tell me what. We sat in the back room while she scrolled through digital files on an ancient, wheezing desktop. Her fingers moved fast, too fast for her age, I thought. But Marjorie had always been sharper than people gave her credit for. That man, she muttered, left more revision drafts than a cheap novelist. But every one of them was properly notarized. Except, she paused. Here. She clicked open a folder labeled Callahan, Preliminary Probate, Private. Inside were 4 draft wills. 3 matched the official timeline. The 4th was dated 6 weeks before Charles died and had been flagged as pending removal. What does that mean? I asked. She leaned closer. It means someone tried to delete this from our internal servers. They didn't request it formally, just tried to purge the file from the back end. But I log all edits. And who was it? Marjorie double-clicked the edit log. A single name appeared, Bethany Callahan. Marjorie looked at me, voice low. That girl came here 3 days after Charles' stroke. Said she was cleaning up outdated drafts. Wanted to be thorough. But this one? This one named you as sole executor. It was simpler, cleaner. Charles probably meant to rework it, but she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I asked for a certified copy. She printed it, stamped it, signed a statement confirming the edit log and the unauthorized deletion attempt. Then she stood, handed me the papers, and said, "You were always the right one." He just didn't realize how soon he'd need you to act. Back at the estate, I added the draft and Marjorie's affidavit to my binder. Exhibit H, unfiled will, draft deletion attempt, with a post-it beside it. Deleted is not the same as gone. Because digital erasure is never perfect. Bethany knew how to manipulate memory, but she never learned the first rule of legacy. The clerk remembers everything. The Callahan estate glowed gold in the late afternoon sun. It was the kind of dusk Charles loved most, when the light hit the ivy in just the right way and the stained glass windows scattered color across the front hall. In all the years I spent here, I never imagined I'd walk through those doors as both widow and litigant. But this time, I didn't come to mourn. I came to reclaim. Bethany was already seated in the drawing room, legs crossed, chin tilted high like she was posing for an oil painting. Miles lingered by the drinks cabinet. Lila was back from wherever she'd been hiding, jumpy, pale, wearing sunglasses indoors. They thought I'd come to beg, to compromise. Instead, I walked in with a leather satchel and a file marked, "The Truth." I didn't speak right away. I laid the binder on the coffee table between us. Let it sit like a coiled snake. Bethany didn't look at it, but her eyes flicked once toward the satchel. Smart girl. She already knew. "Irene," Bethany said, smooth and rehearsed. "Before you say anything, I want to remind you that this house, this family, is under intense scrutiny right now. The last thing we need is scandal." "Then you shouldn't have committed fraud," I replied. Her face didn't move, but Miles flinched. "And Lila?" She took off her sunglasses. I opened the binder and began to speak, not with rage, not with sorrow, but with authority. 1. I have Charles's final will, notarized and witnessed, naming me sole executor and primary heir. 2. I have the Callahan clause, preserved in the original trust charter, confirming that any altered or incomplete will is overridden by the last fully ratified testament. 3. I have your medical forgery attempt, the letter you submitted from a dead doctor. Bethany opened her mouth. I held up a hand. 4. I have the family fund ledger, the one you paid your problems out of, including your media suppression scheme and the Walter Pierce payoff. Miles muttered, "Jesus." Bethany's lips tightened. 5. I have the archive deletion log. You tried to wipe the draft that named me executor before Charles's stroke. You failed. The county didn't. I paused. Let the silence settle like a judge's gavel. Then, I reached into the satchel and placed a flash drive on the table. On here is the full audio file of Charles's final dictation. He names me as heir. He calls out your pressure tactics. And he confirms he never signed the will you filed. Bethany stared at the drive like it might detonate. What do you want? She asked at last. Everything, I said. Not out of revenge. Out of correction. This estate doesn't belong to you. Not legally. Not ethically. It never did. And if we challenge it, then I release everything to the press. Every file. Every voice memo. Every ledger. You destroy the family name? No, I said, standing. You already did. I'm here to rebuild it with truth. Bethany didn't speak again. But when I left the room, she didn't follow. And neither did the others. Because they knew. I hadn't come for a compromise. I'd come for a reckoning. And dusk was no longer their hour. It was mine. The courtroom was colder than I remembered. Not physically, but in the way everyone looked at me. Some with curiosity, some with pity, a few with contempt. But none of that mattered. Because when I took the stand, I wasn't Irene the widow. I wasn't the second wife. I was the executor. The true executor. Lorraine opened the hearing with surgical precision. She presented the certified will, dated, notarized, and confirmed by the court archivist's log. She presented the Callahan clause and its 1987 filing certificate. She detailed the family fund. Then came the audio file. The room went still as Charles's voice filled the space, crackling softly through the speakers. If they're hearing this, it means I'm gone. And if Irene's playing this in court, then they did what I feared. They tried to take what wasn't theirs. She's the one I trust, not because she married me late in life, but because she stood beside me through the parts they never wanted to see. Let her carry the name. Let her finish what I couldn't. You could have heard a pin drop. Miles wouldn't meet my eyes. Lila looked like she wanted to crawl into the floor. Bethany sat stone-faced, like a statue that had finally cracked from the inside out. The judge, a woman in her 60s with the look of someone who had no patience for posturing, shuffled the papers carefully. Then she looked at me. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, "do you wish to make a statement?" I stood, hands steady, spine straight. "Yes, Your Honor. I loved my husband. I stayed quiet when they buried me in that obituary, when they excluded me from the will, when they lit fires, literal and legal, to keep me out. But silence isn't consent. And legacy isn't what you leave behind in stone. It's what you protect while you're still standing. I'm standing now." The judge didn't deliberate long. The ruling was swift. Public. The revised will is deemed invalid. The court recognizes the original testament signed on February 9th as the lawful last will and testament of Charles Callahan. Executor rights and estate ownership are hereby transferred to Irene Callahan. All subordinate claims are void. Bethany stood. For the record, the judge, raised her hand. This isn't a performance, Ms. Callahan. You had your chance. She banged the gavel once. That sound echoed louder than any scream. And, just like that, it was done. Back at the estate, I opened the library doors and let the wind carry through. For the first time in months, the place felt like it breathed. Like it remembered me. Because now I wasn't a guest in my own legacy. I was the keeper of it. It took 4 days to change the brass plate on the estate gate. The old one read, Callahan House, EST 1894. The new one read, Callahan Foundation, EST 1894/restored 2025. Irene Callahan, executor. A small change. But everything changed with it. Bethany never spoke to me again. Miles wrote a short letter filled with half regrets and inherited shame. I responded with quiet acknowledgement. Lila vanished to Europe, her name removed from the trust entirely under court order. The family splintered. Not because I broke it, because I stopped pretending it was whole. With Lorraine's help, I restructured the estate. The West Wing became a research center for estate justice and probate reform. The old library turned into a legal archive, complete with a corner table named the floorboard desk. Every Friday, we host workshops. Not just for lawyers. For widows. For caretakers. For women who were erased by the silence of rich men and their legal heirs. I live alone now. But not lonely. Because this house no longer echoes with ghosts, it echoes with footfalls, voices, new ideas. Students. Journalists. Formerly silenced women. And I walk among them not as a relic, not as the wife of, but as Irene. My will is written. Clean. Digital. Witnessed. But the last line? That I wrote by hand. Let the record show I was not erased. I was not forgotten. I was not a chapter in someone else's book. I was the author. And now, when I pass the grand doors and see the sunlight hitting my name in brass, I think not of Charles or Bethany or legal clauses. I think of the sound the floor made when I first pulled up that board. The creak of truth. The gasp of buried power waking. The moment I realized I wasn't here to be inherited. I was here to inherit myself.